Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology, joined by Dr. Samuel Klumpenhouwer, who is going to be talking about the translation that he has made of the Glossa Ordinaria on the book of Genesis. I have a link to it there in the show notes, but here is a copy of it, and this thing is incredible. The Glossa Ordinaria, if you're not familiar with it, is the medieval commentary, or one of the medieval commentaries that Christians use, especially in the Latin West, to understand sacred scripture. And this thing is just immaculate, so I cannot praise it anymore. I highly encourage everybody to get a copy of it. I want to talk about this translation, its history, the project of translating it, all that kind of good stuff with Dr. Samuel here. So welcome to the show. How are you?
Doing well. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
It's an honor to have you on. I'm so excited. I think I may have told you on the phone that right before Christmas, the only thing that I could think of that I wanted for Christmas was this. This is the thing that I thought, okay, what do I want? Well, I want the commentary on Genesis, the Glossa Ordinaria. And I think it was like right around that time, maybe the same day, that you contacted me and sent me a copy, and I was just like, man, this is so providential. And so here we are. I've been actually meaning to reach out to you to get you to come on the show to talk about this. So it's just incredible the way it all worked out. Well, tell me a little bit about yourself before we dive into the gloss first.
Sure. So I'm a Canadian by birth. Grew up in Ontario, and did all my studies up there. I was raised a Protestant and became a Catholic into my 20s.
Mm-hmm.
Went to the University of Toronto, and that's where I did all my degrees, a BA, MA, and then finally my PhD at the Center for Medieval Studies there in Toronto. And that's where I first encountered the text. There were a number of scholars spending time with the Glossa Ordinaria up there, and so got to know through of the text there. After I graduated, I moved down to Texas, which is where I live now.
Mm-hmm.
And I married an American, got one daughter now, and so it was after I moved down to Texas that I decided to spend my time translating the Glossa Ordinaria. It wasn't what I did for my dissertation, but it's where all my time goes now. As my wife will tell you, every spare minute.
That's where it goes.
She's a gracious woman, and she lets me just spend every spare minute with this beautiful text.
Well, what drew you to the gloss specifically?
Sure. So on the one hand was my love of the Bible. I was raised with the Bible in hand and read it over and over as a child, and then studied it more professionally, if you will, in college and university. So on the one hand, there was that love that's been there throughout my life. But while I was doing my doctoral program, I was spending a lot of time with these texts from the early universities in the 12th century, in the 13th century. And one of the practices of these early university masters was to gloss a text, to take an authoritative text, in this case the Bible, and to write glosses, notes, little explanatory passages in the margins. And they would do this not just with the Bible, but with other texts as well. And so I worked a fair bit during my doctoral studies. I was working not with the Glossa Ordinaria on the Bible, but there's actually another Glossa Ordinaria on canon law, and that's where I spent most of my time during my PhD program. So I was pretty familiar with the environment that this glossing environment in the early schools, and how they were working with texts. And so then after I graduated, that's when I shifted my focus a bit away from the canon law text to the Bible itself, and I just fell in love with doing this kind of work. And again, that's where all my time goes.
Well, tell me a little bit about the history of the Glossa Ordinaria. I know you write about it at the beginning here, but yeah, if you can cover that for us as well.
Well, yes, so it's very much tied to the story of the universities, the European medieval universities, which are starting to appear in the 12th century, roughly speaking. Before that, a lot of education is either in monastic schools or in schools attached to cathedrals. And in fact, the Glossa Ordinaria in a way predates the universities, or is part of the story, the founding of the universities. But what you have is you have a number of people teaching in cathedral schools originally, later at universities, and they want to, theology at this point in time means the study of the Bible. Theology is not, nowadays we divide it to systematic theology and biblical theology and all that.
Sure.
What we mean by theology in this period is the study of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And so all their time is being focused on the Bible. And so they're reading it in a lecture. There's a lectio. There's a lecture. In other words, the master, there's a talented master who's reading the text very slowly and very closely to a number of students. And as he's reading through the text, he's pausing to make explanations. Maybe there's a term in the Bible that is confusing because it's from another culture, or maybe there's a theological point that he wants to elaborate on. So as he's lecturing, he is stopping now and then and giving these little explanatory notes. And either he or his students, there's actually we actually don't know all that much about how exactly the text was written, but through this process, or whatever you want to say, of students copying down notes they hear, teachers copying down notes they say, over time a number of these little explanatory notes became standardized, and so now you have the gloss, which are these explanatory notes, but they become ordinaria, in other words, a standard, and then they take on a certain authority. So this all happens over the course of the 12th century. Mm-hmm. And eventually this particular set of notes on the Bible becomes authoritative. And if you read Thomas Aquinas, you won't read far before he says the gloss says this, or the gloss says that. And this is the text that he's referring to, what we call the Glossa Ordinaria, this standard set of teacher notes. So nowadays we think of it, and even on the book itself, it's called a Bible commentary. It is a Bible commentary, but not quite like we think of a Bible commentary now, where where it's a reference tool that you go to get some definitive answer. This was a text used in the schools, which means that it's not meant to answer every question. Mm-hmm. It's not meant to be exhaustive, and it's also meant actually to raise questions. So as you're reading through the gloss, sometimes it'll answer a question you might have, but other times it'll give you two sides that you might take. So there's this continuing debate even today over, for instance, the value or authority of the Hebrew Masoretic text of the Bible versus the Septuagint. And we still debate this even to this day, and in the Middle Ages as well. So you'll get these differing opinions on the value of either, between Jerome and Augustine, are reproduced in the gloss, and they're meant to kind of start a conversation in the classroom about these issues. So ultimately it was a teaching tool, and then later on became more of a reference tool.
Now you're referring specifically to the interlinear commentary, correct? What about the marginal commentary? And for those who are not familiar, let me just pull it up on the screen so we can maybe distinguish between these, and then you can answer that.
Yeah.
Explain to us what we're looking at here.
So in the center here, we've, as the editor, we've put it in red. This is the biblical text. In this case, this is all in Latin. This is a Latin commentary, and so I used the Douay-Rheims translation from, which is directly from the Latin. So you have the biblical text right there in the middle. In between those lines of red biblical text, you have these short little glosses, talking a little bit about what does this signify, or what does this mean, and so on and so forth. And they're very abbreviated, and if someone gets a copy of this book, they're going to be confused by them, because these are very similar to kind of notes to jog the memory of the master. So he's going to read this very abbreviated interlinear note, and he's going to remember a more fuller conversation that he wants to bring up during the lecture. And that's the same thing. I mean, I'm a teacher, and teachers do that even to this day, right? You're teaching some novel, and you write a short little note in the margin just to kind of remind yourself to talk about this or that issue as you're reading. Around the text, so that's the interlinear between the lines that we were just talking about. Around the text in the margins, you have these longer passages, and these are excerpts from largely from the church fathers, from Augustine, from Jerome, from Gregory, from various works of theirs, in this case on the book of Genesis. And so the master might read these to the students, but more so used as a reference tool to remind him of the main authorities that have written on the book of Genesis. So here in the margins is where often you'll find these, back and forth between Jerome and Augustine, or just, for instance, with the ones on Gregory, along talking about the moral meaning of a passage or something like this. And so that's the marginal gloss there. And so largely the marginal gloss is taken from the church fathers. There are some medieval sources used, but largely these are a collection of excerpts that medieval scholars combed through the larger works of Augustine and Jerome and excerpted, copied these relatively short passages from the church fathers. And keep in mind, at this point in time, nowadays we can afford to own, for instance, the complete works of Augustine, whether digitally or hard copy. That's a feasible thing for us to do nowadays. And in fact, you can go online and it's all free. But in the Middle Ages, to own a complete work was immensely expensive. And so what this gloss is doing is that it's giving the reader access to a larger exegetical tradition without the financial burden of owning, dozens of complete manuscripts, which were, again, of immense expense.
But we don't know for sure who compiled them.
Right. So there's the main person associated with the compilation it's a medieval compilation of these patristic sources. The main person associated is a man called Anselm of Laon, and his brother Ralph, and a number of people in his circle in these schools in northern France and Laon, or eventually in Paris, are associated with this project. But yes, it's very hard to tie a particular name of someone who compiled it to a particular book. And so largely they're anonymous. There are theories about who was responsible for doing the compilation for each book, but apart from Gilbert the Universal for Lamentations, that's the one book that we do know, but everyone else is mostly guesswork.
Yeah. Now, tell me a little bit about medieval exegesis. I recall you have a section here at the introduction about that. Tell us how it maybe differs a little bit from exegesis today.
So the medievals, and they're following St. Paul here and Christ himself in the New Testament, believe that there are multiple meanings of Scripture. There's what they call the literal meaning. Now that's a fuller meaning than we associate with the word literal. Nowadays, when we hear the word, what it literally means, when you're reading the Bible, we think, I don't know what it physically means or something like this. It's like, they have a fuller meaning. So for instance, in the New Testament, Jesus says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. And we kind of have this idea that the literal meaning is that you have to physically pluck out your eye.
Right.
But that's not what they mean by the literal meaning. What they mean is what do the letters mean? So what do the words mean? So this is going to take into account rhetorical devices that are being used. That's all part of the literal meaning. It's also going to take into account basically everything that, if you went to a university and studied the Bible nowadays, and spent all that time studying the cultures in which they were written, studying the languages and all of that type of study that you would encounter in a modern university faculty, that's all the literal meaning,
right? Essentially.
And that's the base. You have to understand what the letter means before you can do anything else. But just as the words signify something, the literal meaning, just as the word Abraham signifies a historical figure of Abraham, so too things can signify other things. So the word Abraham signifies the historical figure. The historical figure in turn signifies something deeper. He is a true historical figure. So we're not getting rid of the literal sense, but we're going deeper and saying that, okay, Abraham is also a figure of Christ. And when you have these episodes, Abraham and Isaac, the sacrifice of Isaac, this is certainly signifying something more than just the historical event. I mean, Isaac carrying the wood up for the sacrifice. I mean, it leads you directly to Christ, and so to everything else. So that way of looking at the events in the Bible, the figures in the Bible, as a way to signify Christ and the church, like Abraham and Isaac signifying Jesus on the cross. That's what they would call the allegorical sense, a spiritual sense. And so now we have both the literal and the allegorical sense. They also talked about other senses, such as the moral sense. And we mean here not so much the commandments, like the 10 commandments. The literal meaning will give you that you shouldn't kill. We're talking here about what do events and figures of the Bible, how do they teach us how to live our life? So the story of the Exodus is not just the story of a historical event. It's also the story of how the soul escapes from evil, from Egypt, and reaches eventually the promised land, heaven. And so that's the moral sense, taking events like that and using them as a way to teach us how to live our lives. And then they would have a fourth sense. Some of them would have it as a distinct sense. Some say it's just another type of allegory, some people, but what they call the anagogical sense, namely, how do these events not so much talk about Christ in the New Testament, but about the end of times. And so, the story of Noah and the ark, this is a purging also of signifies a purging that will take place at the end of time, not with water, but with fire at the end of the time. So we have here four senses. This is the famous fourfold sense, the literal, and then three spiritual senses: allegorical, moral, anagogical. And these are not alternative ways of understanding the Bible, that these are meanings of the Bible that are all there present together. And so you don't have to choose one or the other. It's a richer way of reading the Bible and seeing the full meaning and the full power of this text.
Yeah, the quadriga, as it's called. I have found that fascinating and also a breath of fresh air compared to a lot of the exegesis today.
Yeah, whatever you might say about exegesis today is like, and it's not that I can like disprove it or anything. It's just boring.
Yeah.
It is. What else can you say?
It is. I agree with you. And so I found, for instance, the gloss on Ruth to be one of the most fascinating things and enriching things to read, aside from scripture itself. I mean, obviously, when you're reading the gloss on Ruth, you are also reading scripture, but then the commentary on it, I just found it to be amazing. I'd probably put that as one of my favorite books out there of all time, just because of how it can point typologically and allegorically to Jesus in so many ways. And so I appreciate that. What were some things that you were hoping that would be accomplished by specifically translating this?
Yes. I don't know if I had plans, but hopes. Okay, yeah, I like that word.
Sure,
I'll go with the hopes.
Yeah.
One is to reinvigorate and to show people that the literal meaning is important, and you can't escape it. And it's Thomas Aquinas says it's the basis, it's the foundation of the other meanings. And so, what you study in the university faculty, I'm not trying to get rid of modern exegesis in that sense, but there's also this sense that to stay with the letter is death, and it's the spirit that brings life. And so you it's not enough to understand what the words mean, the literal sense. You also have to see how these things lead to Christ. And so ultimately, I want exegesis to be something that makes you a saint. The scholarship is not that it makes you a great scholar and all this kind of stuff. I mean, maybe that'll happen, maybe it will not. But I mean, the Bible should be something that brings life. And for these medievals, it was something that brought life. It was something that transformed them. It was something that aided them in becoming saints. And in fact, the greatest exegetes were saints. And so that connection between biblical scholarship and sanctity, needs to be there. And you can't be a great exegete without it either. So anyways, I loved the text, and I want to share that love with other people. So
how did the use of the gloss, well, I guess, how did it fall out of use? Do you know historically, like when did we stop using this and valuing it?
So there's some limitations to the text. One is, so originally I was saying it comes out of the classroom. And so that means there's some limitations to it. It means the amount of material that you are exposed to is going to be pretty limited. It's about the amount of material you'd get from, a semester course nowadays for each book or for each set of books or for a part of books. So it's limited in that sense. It's also limited somewhat linguistically, because it's a Latin text that at this point in the 12th century, we don't have a lot of access in the West to Greek texts, so it's limited somewhat in its sources, and it's also limited somewhat in its format. I mean, because if you read it, it wasn't meant to just be read like a modern commentary, and so it's hard read. Your eye is not really sure where to go, and all of this. Over time, you see the beauty of it, but it's a bit of an acquired taste. And as you can see, I'm not the best salesman for this text, but
I think it speaks for itself. It's awesome. I mean, it really is. And was there a gloss on every book of the Bible, including the Deuterocanonicals?
There was a gloss on every book of the Bible, and it remained popular throughout the Middle Ages, but because of especially because of the comprehensiveness, there were other works that were more comprehensive that eventually not took its place, but kind of lived alongside it, like Nicholas of Lyra, Apostolae, and so on and so forth. But then also, so that's one reason why it started to fall out of use. One, because of its tied to a university curriculum, whereas a lot of other people were just looking for kind of a reference Bible, like we might think of it now. The other reason, though, is tied to the Reformation. I mean, at the end of the day, there is this attempt to give people the scriptura nuda, the scripture alone. In other words, not surrounded with this commentary tradition, because at the end of the day, the gloss was seen by Luther, who was very familiar with it, but and used it and respected it, but ultimately as a Catholic work, and very tied with a way of reading the Bible that a lot of the reformers didn't like. And so it fell out of use among the Protestants. That said, I mean, if you're familiar with a lot of the early Protestant translations, they kind of had a gloss of their own. If you look at the Geneva Bible, for instance, I mean, it has these kind of glosses surrounding the text. And so even among Protestants, they have their own kind of tradition of glossing. There were in the late 1400s onwards, it was printed about a dozen times. The gloss. It was a very expensive project, but they printed it beautifully, and it's from the first printed edition from 1480. So it was printed pretty early on, just a couple decades later after Gutenberg. It was printed by a man called Adolf Roosch, and that's actually the base text that I used for the translation of Genesis, and also for future volumes.
How did they print this? Yeah, I got a copy of Roosch here. Pull it up. Kind of see it here. All right. One question that I have is formatting this thing, right? Like, how do you do it to where you don't come up with, like, you run out of space and then it bleeds over into the next page and messes everything on up? And like, how do you keep it in this format?
Yeah, it's modern word processors make it easier, but I mean, even with Microsoft Word, it's pretty difficult, and you got to have a
I've
real
tried to with
eye.
a word processor, and
Yeah,
it wasn't working.
yeah. I've kind of built up my own way of doing it.
Did you?
Roosh,
Okay.
who the one you were printing there, I mean, even more so. I mean, the genius, just the kind of spatial uh, genius that you would need to lay it out for both in a manuscript, if you're a medieval scribe or one of these early printers, where mistakes cost you a lot of time. I mean, yeah, it's the amount of time they spend with it, and also just their ability to kind of envision the page and the ratios of how much text to how much commentary. Yeah, it's remarkable. It's a remarkable feat that these guys did. And because even with a modern word presser, it's still very difficult, let alone when you're putting letters in individually into a press.
Seems like I've seen some glosses that did not have this kind of format. Let me show you an example. I
Mm-hmm.
like looking at illuminated manuscripts, and
Yeah.
I've come across some instances where, okay, like this, for example, um, it it's just kind of two columns instead of the other format.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on there?
Yeah, there, if, the prologues, that I think is not a gloss. That's just Jerome's prologue, and that would have just been
Okay,
copied or typed straight up.
I gotcha,
Um, in that
gotcha.
case, but there are other situations, especially in the medieval manuscripts, where there's a lot. The format is more sporadic, if you will.
Mhm.
It kind of jags. The biblical text kind of jags in and out, and it's not consistently in two columns like that. So there is among the manuscripts, there is a fair bit of variety among format. They still have the kind of basic idea of interlineary and marginal, but they're a bit more flexible. And there's been some full-length studies. Yeah, here. Yeah, this one printed edition here. Yeah.
Mhm. You see the illumination on it. Yeah.
That's right. And just like with Gutenberg's Bible, so too with these early printed editions, they would leave space for
Mhm.
those illuminations after the printing. Yeah.
I
But
love
it's
that.
remarkable. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, it's a work of art in and of itself.
Mhm.
Um, Golly. So tell me about Strabo's version in the Patrologia Latina. It seems like that one
Yeah.
did not contain the interlinear commentary. What was going on with
So,
that?
so of those dozen editions, that was the last time it was printed.
Mhm.
For the PL. It used to be thought that Strabo, this monk from the 8th or 9th century, was responsible for the gloss. That's nowadays no one. He's been discredited, if you will. People from his period were important. I'm not saying that, but the genius for this thing is more so later in the 12th century with Anselm and so on and so forth. But the PL version one. Well, I should give the PL a bit more credit here, because the belief here was that Strabo was responsible for the marginal gloss, and
Mhm.
that Anselm was responsible for the interlinear gloss. And they
Mhm.
had this idea that they wanted to present the reader with the original. And so, in other words, they didn't want these accretions, these later additions by Anselm. So they just cut out the interlinear gloss completely and just gave you the marginal gloss
Mm.
kind of like as a normal text. But
Mm.
even there, they don't even give you all the marginal gloss. They'll give
Really?
you the start of it, and then they'll say, essentially dot dot dot, and
Oh.
then the end of it. So they don't even give you all the marginal gloss. And
Ah.
so it's a bit of a cut up version that's
Yeah.
very difficult to use. I mean,
Wow.
it's the most available because it's in the PL, and
Mhm.
so a lot of people still go to it. But there's great online versions, images from Adolf Roosh, which I use, which you can find online. So you don't need to feel limited to the PL. That
Yeah, so
people
Rouge
were
is
for
kinda
quite
where
a
you
while.
wanna go if you're going to the Latin.
Yeah, yeah, and Roosh. There are a lot of varieties among manuscripts of the gloss, both in exactly what's in there and somewhat in the format. And so Roosh is giving you one version of that, but it is a version that dates pretty early, and and just for practical reasons, he's kind of become the go-to edition for people working with this text.
You had also mentioned that there were other glosses, one on canon law,
Mhm.
and I believe you mentioned Gracian's decree.
Mhm.
I pulled it up here. Look at this
Oh,
beauty
beautiful.
with this
Yeah,
illuminated
yeah.
manuscript, and then all of this going on. So I suppose this is what you had in mind, correct?
That's
Um,
right. I mean, this is an initial page that doesn't
mhm,
give you the full sense, but yes. So what's happening here? The Gracian's Decretum. This was the textbook used to train church lawyers. Yeah, there's a great example. This
mhm,
was the textbook used to train church lawyers in the Middle Ages, and actually was an authoritative book
mhm,
up until the modern code of 1917.
mhm,
But what it is, it's a collection of canons
mhm,
uh, eh, or sentences, a collection of excerpts from church fathers, from the Bible, from church councils, etc. And so Gratian collected all of these canons together. And what he wanted to do was to show how all these canons harmonized, because it seemed that if you lined up all these different rules from this or that council, that there was a disharmony, that they were contradictory or so on and so forth. But he wanted to show how they could be harmonized. And so, the way to do that was through making distinctions and talking exactly what they meant and so on and so forth. And so the other title for his book is called the um, A Harmony of Discordant Canons. That's the other
mhm,
title for the decretum. So Gratian compiled these canons, and then people later on, as they were teaching these collection of canons in the schools, especially in Italy, these other teachers, these canon lawyers, would write in the margins,
mhm,
more explanations about this or that. And in other words, they started creating a gloss in the margins.
mhm.
And over time, a particular set of these notes also became authoritative. And so you also have a Glossa Ordinaria for canon law as well, which you can also access freely online. There's some great resources online to see the whole thing. Now, the one difference is that they don't have, with the canon law glosses, there's no interlinear gloss. It's just marginal.
Yeah, yes, I noticed that
Mhm.
here. Yeah, and I think we were talking about this. The modern NET Bible has revived this sort of format. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
I actually got it right
Mhm.
over there.
Yeah.
I was really happy to see
Yeah,
that.
another difference between the two texts, though, is that the Gloss Ordinary on canon law
Mhm,
um, has a sort of official approval to it, a
mhm,
particular version, and there were popes that commissioned authoritative editions of it, and so on and so
mhm,
forth. The gloss on the Bible never had that kind of papal authority. It never had
mm,
that official stamp of approval. It gained of its own accord a type of authority and deference that you encounter when you read Thomas Aquinas,
mhm.
but it never had this kind of official stamp of authority. So there's not the sense that this is the be all and end all Bible commentary. That's not what it is. It was never meant to be exhaustive or, the go to for every answer. At the end of the day, it was a teaching tool and more of a manual on how to read the Bible rather than a reference tool that you can go to get answers to whatever question you have.
Just quick side note, I mean, I suppose this was written on vellum, right?
That's right. Yeah, you can see
Um,
the
yeah, I
hairs.
was about to say, I imagine these are pores, right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah,
Okay.
some
Alright.
cheaper calf from 800
Yeah.
years ago, and you can still see the hairs from it.
Okay.
It's amazing the detail you get with
Oh,
modern
yeah,
images here. Yeah, it's
this image
beautiful.
is incredible, but w
So much so that, as someone who works with manuscripts a fair bit, I mean, there are times you have to have the physical thing in
mhm,
hand,
mhm,
but the amount of very serious manuscript work you can have,
yeah,
you can do in the New World here
sure.
is remarkable. And I mean, there are even situations where you actually need the image because the real manuscript is this tiny little thing, and your poor
Yeah,
little
you need
eyes,
to
and
zoom
you,
in,
you need to
yeah.
zoom in and to figure out what's going on.
Well, one thing that is interesting here is that I just do not recognize this font, and everything's also jumbled together, right?
Hmm.
Kind of
Hmm.
going back to the way things were in antiquity. They're not spacing anything out. And again, I don't recognize a single Latin word in here.
Yeah,
So
it takes a while
I bet it
for your eyes
does.
to get used to it. And also the other thing, so, I mean, this is a type of Gothic font they're using. The other thing what's going on here is that um, they also have a system of abbreviations that you just have to get to know over time. So you see over various words these little lines or so on and so forth. So I'm looking up in the top here. We see MOS, so that middle initial, the M there, you see MOS. And then the next word here, you see there's an AUT with a line over top. And you just have to know that that's an abbreviated word. That's AUTEM, AUTEM. That's what the actual word is. That line lets you know that it's abbreviated, and you just have to know how to expand the abbreviations. There's a system, and you get to know it over time. But yeah, it's not enough just to know Latin to work with this stuff. You have to be able to read the scripts, and you have to know the shorthand that they're using.
Some of the New Testament Greek manuscripts have similarities, like with Kurios, right? You know, they would abbreviate.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. What is this a palimpsest, or is this just a marginal note or
No,
something?
that's just
You
a
notice that
marginal.
right here.
Yeah.
I'm
I
just
can't read that little scribble, but
That's
there's something there scribbled in
so
by a reader later on.
yeah, so they would just kind of add their little commentary on it.
Yeah, that's
Wow,
right. That's
wow.
right.
Well, getting back to the gloss specifically on Genesis, tell me, sorry, I changed screen there. Tell me, what was something that you got out of this, as far as the commentary itself, that you found fascinating?
I love the stories of Jacob and Esau and how they're reading them. There's this beautiful moment where Jacob is going to receive the blessing from Isaac at the end, and Esau goes out into the field to hunt, and Jacob comes to receive the blessing. His mother knows that it belongs to Jacob because, when she had the twins in her womb and they were fighting, and she went to the Lord for explanation, and it was revealed to her that it's the younger that shall rule. And so she helps him receive this blessing. He's already without sin got the birthright from Esau. And it's clear the gloss believes that Jacob did this without sin. Esau sinned in giving it away so cheaply, but Jacob did no sin. There's the whole story here. But in any case, as Rebecca is preparing Jacob to go into Isaac, she clothes Jacob with the garments of Esau, with the skins of Esau. And I'd never known this story, but the gloss, I think it's a gloss from Jerome, brings up how there's this Hebrew tradition that these garments of skin were priestly garments. And so what's happening in this moment is that Jacob is taking the place of his brother, not just in the birthright generally, but in the birthright, which included a firstborn priesthood. It's clear from the Bible that there was a priesthood before Aaron.
Yeah, of the firstborn, right? Yeah,
that's right. And that here it's going to Jacob. And there's another Hebrew tradition. Jerome doesn't subscribe to it necessarily, but he kind of throws it out that these garments are actually date all the way back to Adam, and these are the garments that God gave Adam expelled from the garden. And so there's just these beautiful traditions to see, one, how they're reading the Bible, and that's all under the literal sense, and it's so rich. I mean, it's richer than you normally do, even under the literal sense. But then also there's just this great perception into these recurring patterns that occur throughout the Bible. And one of these patterns is this pattern of the younger supplanting, taking the place of the elder. This happens with Jacob and Esau. This happens with, of course, with Abel and Cain, and then with Seth and Cain. This happens with David, the youngest brother, who gets the kingship. Moses and Aaron. Moses is the younger. And ultimately, this pattern is fulfilled, and all of these types of patterns are fulfilled in the New Testament and in the life of Christ in the church, because it's the younger brother, the church, who takes the place of the elder brother as well. And so just this great insight into these patterns of Scripture, which are ultimately patterns of life. I mean, I just love reading through, and they have a great eye to these details that you don't hear about normally.
And of course, the second Adam,
That's
taking
right.
the
Yeah,
place of the
yeah.
first Adam, right?
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, what was their perspective in the gloss on, things like the flood and stuff like that? They're reading this as history, correct?
That's right. And another word for the literal is the historical sense. And so,
Hmm.
yes, they do believe that these are historical events, and that was very important to them. There's
Hmm.
still some debate on, this or that detail. So,
Sure.
in the 6 days, for instance, there's this debate not over young or old Earth, but more so over whether the 6 days were
Yeah.
instantaneous or 6 24-hour periods. So there's still some debates that in that way. But yes, they did believe that these were historical events, the Garden of Eden, the flood of Noah, etc. And they go into the detail. They go into great detail, kind of explaining how this or that worked. And it's amazing. I mean, even when you read some of the authors that are thought to be more allegorical, who didn't care anything for the literal sense, I'm thinking specifically of Origin here.
Hmm.
Even he goes to great detail to explain, how. So there's this question of how could the ark, if it's such and such cubits long, how could have it held everything? And he goes into this great explanation about how it's, an Egyptian cubit, which is longer than a regular cubit. In other words, he has a great eye for these details and the historical sense of things, even though he's known for his allegory.
Yeah, his commentaries are interesting.
Yeah, and funny
I
enough,
think
I don't have a good answer for this, but Origin is never, so the Latins, he's Greek, but he was
yeah.
known in the West through Latin translations of his homilies, and he's never actually quoted directly in Genesis. But I've been working on the gloss on Exodus, and he's quoted all the time,
Yeah,
excerpted all
okay.
the time.
What about
And
Leviticus too? I mean, he wrote his commentary on Leviticus.
yeah, I haven't spent too much time with the gloss on Leviticus to answer, but it seems that the sources that were used for each book differ, and maybe that's because the person
Yeah.
differed, and there's a whole story there that we don't know too much about.
I mean, he has some interesting ways of interpreting it, but I mean, in a lot of cases, it's clearly a stretch. I think with Origin,
Mhm.
what you noted earlier, the principle of the allegorical or the spiritual sense is rooted in the literal sense. I think he forgets that principle or doesn't operate with it, and he does not root. He just maybe supplants in some cases the spiritual sense and completely ignores the
Mhm.
literal.
And Jerome kind of backs away from that a bit. I mean,
Yes, he does.
Jerome gives a very firm literal sense,
Yes,
linguistic, historical to everything,
he's a lot
and
more
mhm,
balanced.
mhm,
One thing that maybe I don't prefer Jerome as much as maybe Bede though, because Bede is balanced with both, but focuses on the spiritual sense more than I would say Jerome does, at
yeah.
least in what I've read.
No, I'd agree. That's my reading of Jerome too. Is that
Yeah,
he certainly, of course, is a saint, and he's reading the Bible and it's transforming him, but he's not. He doesn't have that preachiness that you, in a good sense, that you get from these other
yeah.
guys.
Before I ask you, and we're wrapping it up here in a moment, before I ask you a couple more questions about some of the people who are quoted here, I just wanted to follow up on something before. There's a commentary in every one of the books of the Bible, including the Deuterocanonicals.
Mhm.
Did it include commentaries on any additional books that we do not have as canonical?
Um,
Prayer of Manasseh or something like that.
yeah,
Some of
I
the
don't.
additional books that maybe the Orthodox would have.
I can't. I don't think so. Not that come to mind, but I'm hesitating, so I don't want to
Yeah,
give
yeah.
a firm answer.
I I I see a lot of Augustine in here,
Mhm.
Gregory Bede, Isidore of Seville.
Yeah,
Who are
that's right.
some other people who are often quoted in
Mhm.
the Glossa Ordinaria?
Yes, Bede, Augustine, Isidore Seville, Gregory the Great for the moral sense, Jerome, in other books, Origin, and then also a lot of these church fathers are being copied from indirectly. So they're being copied. So people in the 800s, let's say, made a compilation that people
Yeah,
in the 1200s are using. So some
right.
of these later compilations are being used, like Robanos, Paschasius for Matthew. So there's a number of people from
Uh-huh.
the early Middle Ages like that. For the Psalms, Cassiodorus. But again, the Latin people, by and large, and it's a somewhat limited, just based on the library resources of the time, somewhat limited. But
Are they
the big
using
names are there.
are they using Florilegia?
That's
Is
right.
that kind of the
They're using Florilegia, but they're also going back to the originals as well.
and just for people who are not familiar, to maybe tell them a little bit about Florilegia.
Yeah, so these are flowers. I love to these excerpts from the church fathers as flowers.
Yeah.
So
Instead of proof texts, and
that's right, the flowers. I'm gonna throw a flower at you to prove my point. Yeah, but these are also collections of excerpts from the church fathers from the 800s, and they're often known as Florilegia. These collections of flowers from the fathers.
Yeah, Alcuin's in here as well.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you about this, because I noticed this on page 58, where it would normally indicate which church father is. It says Strabo, so I guess the PL is what's being
yeah, and it's thought so the whole theory that Strabo was responsible for the whole thing, it's thought came from one of those early glosses by him. But yes, so he was the author of one of these Florilegia in the earlier Middle Ages. He's not the most commonly one used. Robanos is more commonly used, but and you'll see Robanos in there far more often than he does. But yeah, he was responsible for one of these compilations. But it seems that so he was used, but he wasn't the main source.
Robanos wrote. Did he write commentaries on the entire Bible? I think.
I think so.
A lot in the gloss.
Yeah, I've been working with Matthew and Exodus, and he's kind of the go-to for a lot of those texts as well. And so yeah, he has a very important place in this whole story.
Well, wrapping it up here, any final points that you wanted to get in there that you feel that the audience should be made aware of, anything like that?
It's the strangest book you'll ever read.
I agree with that, but in a good way. Right?
Yes, of course.
Not in a bad way. In a good way.
In the way that consumes my life, in every spare minute.
Well, I envy you, because number one, you can read Latin way better than I can, and number two, you can actually read the manuscripts themselves in their fonts that I can't even make one word out of, and I just envy that. But I guess that was the work you did in your PhD.
Yeah, and I didn't know it would end up being used in this way, but God has a plan. I would like to say, just give a word for MAS academic who published the work and really invested a lot of time making it beautiful, and they're doing some great things over there at MAS academic, and so I encourage y'all to support them in whatever way you can. They've been great to work with, and I've been so pleased with them.
And I have a link to it where you can get a copy directly from them in the show notes. Let me grab this super chat here from Bill. Was the fight against rejection of the Old Testament due to scandal caused by literal readings? And the Lord repented of the evil he was to do. Perhaps guide Origin. I don't know if I'm guiding Origin. I don't know if I'm fully following that. Are you?
Yeah, there's this thought that Origin really did help against Marcion in the sense that you had a lot of people who wanted to just throw out the Old Testament completely. But Origin's readings made them palatable is not the right word, but acceptable or showed them the meaning and so on and so forth.
So Origin was actually kind of used to combat the Marcionite.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's interesting to know. Well, once again, thank you so much for coming on. This was incredibly fascinating and a privilege for me to talk to you, because I've never been able to talk to a scholar who has translated part of the gloss before. So I get to ask all the questions I've been personally curious about. So thank you so much for coming on.
Well, I knew of your love from the gloss from an interview you did a few years ago with John Littoral. And very sure about the gloss. It's like, man, I want to. This guy already knows about it. I'm excited here.
You know, I first heard of it in a debate with Gary Machuda and James White. And I
Hmm.
was still Protestant at the time, right? So I'm listening to all these Catholic versus Protestant debates. And Gary Machuda mentioned it. And I think he appealed to it because it contained the Deuterocanonicals. And I think that was kind of the angle. But I was like, what in the world is this Glossa Ordinaria? So I had to go and Google it. And that's where the bug bit me. You know?
Good, good.
But anyways, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. Do you want to? I mean, we certainly plugged the book. Link to it there in the show notes. Anything else that you wanted to put in a plug for? Are you working on anything else at this time, or you got a website?
So yeah, I got a website, samuelklumpenhouwer.com. If you get the book and want to tell me about how strange it is, you can find my email there. Yeah, and I'm working on other volumes right now. The next one I'm working on is Matthew, and there's some other people working on this as well. So we're hoping to get a bunch of volumes out to y'all pretty soon. So
yeah, I'm excited to see the New Testament with gloss on the New Testament, how that maybe compares and contrasts with Genesis and the Old Testament. So I'm looking forward to that. Any idea on when that comes out?
It's going to be a while. You probably won't have anything on paper for another year or so, and then after that, I hope to return to the Old Testament and get the Pentateuch down. And
so, would you go to Exodus?
I
Oh,
already got that half done, but it kind of
got
really it off to the side.
Oh wow. Okay, yeah, the Pentateuch for sure, and hopefully in order is what you'll do. I can't wait for Exodus too. That's one of my favorites. So wow. Again, thank you so much for coming on. And
thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Everybody, go in and get a copy. Link in the show notes. Glossa Ordinaria on the Book of Genesis. Hit that like and the subscribe button while you're at it. We'll see you later. God bless.